All right, Alexander, we have a little bit of palace intrigue in Kiev, and Zelensky has. Well, he's at first it was he fired the prosecutor, the head prosecutor, I guess the general prosecutor, and he hired the head of the SBU as well, the intelligence service of Ukraine, who coincidentally I think I read somewhere they're actually very good friends too, which is interesting. But or they used to be very good friends, childhood friends. But then we got the news a couple of hours later, as the day went along, that they weren't really fired, but they were dismissed. But the reason for all of this going down remains the same. In other words, at first they were fired, but then they clarified that they were dismissed. But the underlying reason has remained the same in that, once again, statements from Kiev, in that there is a sense of treason in the air in the government, in the intelligence services, in the legal branches, and there's a sense that there are forces at work on the Russian side of things, on the Russian Ukraine territory controlled by Russia. There are forces that are working with the Kiev government, and there's a little bit of uneasiness there, according to Zelensky. So, which, to be quite honest, wouldn't surprise me that there are people in the Kiev government who have contact with people in the Russian government or people in the Ukraine government who are now living under Russian controlled areas. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I don't think that's shocking. I personally think that this is a little bit of paranoia, as well as Zelensky in fear of a general perhaps coup against him, and so he's trying to clean house a little bit. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I completely agree. Can I just make a quick observation? This announcement was a big announcement. It's a big announcement of what was a massive purge. And you're absolutely correct in saying that all the initial indications were that these two top officials, the head of the SBU, in Ukraine's intelligence and counterintelligence service, and the Procurator General, who's the equivalent of an Attorney General in the United States, in other words, the head of the judicial branch, the legal branch, that they had both been fired, and then we got a whole clarification later that they'd just been suspended, which strongly suggests major pushback, which also suggests that there's a real challenge here to Zelensky's authority. He tried to assert himself. He tried to sack these people. The attempt to sack them didn't come off. They're still in place, even though they're said to be suspended. But note that this is all being explained and justified on the basis of treason. Treason on the part of the judicial branch, treason on the part of the SBU. They're all in league or contact with the Russians. The Russians have supposedly infiltrated both organizations. These organizations were somehow responsible for Kherson falling under Russian control. This is something that happened months ago, but suddenly we discovered that, there's treason was responsible for all of this. I have to say, I don't buy that. And like yourself, it looks to me like an internal crisis. And it's not difficult to understand why. Now, there's a number of things that have happened. Now, I'm sure you've heard it. It's been all over the place. There's been these rumors over these last few days that a HIMARS system has been sold intact by corrupt Ukrainian officials to the Russians. I don't know whether that's true or not, by the way. I think it could be true, but, who's to say whether it is or isn't true. It may be, if it is true, that this is what has precipitated all of this, that the US got absolutely furious. They said, "Yeah, what is going on?" Zelensky suddenly realized that, he's presiding over not just a corrupt government. He can't have been in any illusions about this, but a government which has all these connections with the Russians. He may have tried to somehow assert himself, if only to satisfy the US. That's one possibility. But I have to say, the scale of the purge, the fact that the Attorney General, I'll call her that, is also involved, suggests that he's worried about a domestic political challenge. And it's not difficult to understand why. The military situation is turning out catastrophic. Lugansk has been lost. Donetsk is in the process of being lost. You've done a really good programs on your channel, which I'd urge everybody to see. They can find you on Rumble as well, about the fact that the Kherson counteroffensive is turning into basically a piece of theatre, a mirage. The million-man army has vanished into the mists. It never existed. The Kherson counteroffensive looks like it's going to follow in the same way. Kharkov is now in danger. There's information that some of these nationalist battalions, which are connected with the SBU, are being put into the line of fire. So there's a rather strange battalion called the Kraken Battalion, which is all kinds of things are alleged against it. I'm choosing my words very carefully. It was based around Kherson region. It's now been sent to the front line in Siversk, where they don't want to be. They're apparently complaining. Some of them wanted to be transferred to other safer locations. So one gets the sense that there's this huge upswing of anger about the leadership that Zelensky has been providing. And all of this is coming on top of a truly catastrophic economic situation. And also, I suspect, a general feeling that in terms of the flows, the financial flows and the arms flows, Zelensky is no longer providing the goods. That money flows from the European Union are starting to dwindle. There was a piece about this in Bloomberg. And that the United States, or at least some people in the United States, are becoming concerned about, this bottomless pit of demands where the weapons are concerned, and that they're starting to worry about weapons appearing on the dark web and all that. So it's easy to understand why Zelensky might feel under pressure and why he's tried to make this preemptive strike by carrying out this purge. And note that it hasn't fully worked, because the people he aimed at, and you're absolutely right, the SBU man is a personal friend, and apparently he's campaign organizer when he stood for the presidency. So they're very close. They're still there. They're still in the positions from which unquestionably he tried to sack them.
Yeah, I've read those stories about how the EU is buckling with regards to getting money to Ukraine. They wanted to get 9 billion, but they can't even get 1 billion, from what I understand. And Germany is having a hard time getting that money to Zelensky. And sometimes I think that the HIMARS, all the hype around the HIMARS, serves as a distraction to the fact that the weapons that Ukraine really needs, like to fight this artillery war with Russia, are also not making their way to the Ukraine military. So they have these HIMARS kind of take up all the oxygen, even though they're not going to make a difference in the war. And everything else that the military does need is just not arriving, or it's getting sold off or hitting the black market or just getting destroyed the minute it crosses the border. But who do you think is propping up Zelensky? And who do you think is trying to remove Zelensky? Because I think we should just call it like it is. There's some sort of coup, regime change. I'm not saying it's happening. I'm not saying it's a definite, but it's in the air. It's in the air. It's there. Who do you think, or what forces do you believe are trying to get Zelensky out? And what forces do you think are trying to keep Zelensky in? And my follow-up question to that is, do you think there are forces at work that want to escalate because they feel Zelensky's not escalating enough? Or do you think that there are forces that are saying we need to negotiate because this is a train wreck?
I don't think that it's the second, I'm sorry to say. I think that all the push is for escalation. Who is propping up Zelensky? Who's trying to remove him? I think if you really want to answer those questions, don't look to Kiev, look to Washington, because everything about this suggests that this is a battle being played out in Washington. I can very well imagine that the Pentagon, the military people, some of the people in the deep state, the intelligence apparatus, are absolutely exasperated by Zelensky. They say he's a incompetent leader. He's making one bad decision, one bad call after another. They probably sense the anger and disillusion with him in Kiev amongst the political class there, and they're saying, let's try and find someone else. Maybe General Zelensky, the commander of the Ukrainian army, maybe he'd be the better person. He'd make the better decisions. And then I can imagine that there's another faction, perhaps more associated with the White House and the State Department, which is saying, we can't get rid of Zelensky. He's the person we built up. We've called him George Washington. We've called him all these extraordinary things. And besides, he is the figure of legitimate authority in Ukraine, elected according to their constitution. If we remove him, if we shunt him aside, then the whole thing will just collapse like a house of cards. So I suspect that we're seeing that the major place where this is being fought out is in Washington itself. I doubt, actually, that Zelensky has much institutional support in Kiev. I don't think he's ever had it. I don't think he has it now.
I read somewhere that that the Russians are actually, I don't want to use the word happy, but they're okay with Zelensky being in power because he's such a clownish figure and he's so incompetent that it actually serves their interests. It serves their purposes with regards to this special military operation, and that the worst thing to happen with regards to the leadership in Kiev would be if someone competent actually ended up replacing Zelensky. I mean, that would be something that the Russians may say, it's better to keep him in there because he's such a clownish figure. He's so dumb and incompetent that this is making our lives much easier. God forbid that maybe someone with some brains or some leadership actually does replace him. That would be like the worst thing for the Kremlin. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think it's entirely true at the start of the war and for some time afterwards. Notice that throughout that period, and indeed still, the Russians have made no attempt to come after Zelensky himself. I mean, they know where he is, of course they do, but they've never ever attempted to do a decapitation strike against him, which would have been fully within their capabilities. So I think it's absolutely true. They calculated to themselves better, this idiot running things in Kiev. He's going to make all the wrong decisions, which he is doing. He's going to blunder and make a mess. And of course, we can incrementally and methodically capitalize on this. Now, I think that over the last couple of weeks, that calculus may be starting to change, in the sense that I think that the Russians probably now feel that the military situation in Ukraine is now weakened on the Ukrainian side to the point where it really doesn't matter how good or bad the leadership in Kiev is, because they're not going to be able to pull it round. I mean, we started from a situation at the start of the special operation where the Ukrainian army in Donbass outnumbered the Russian. And now it's the other way round, because Ukrainian losses there in men, material, munitions, all those things has been so high. So I think that it matters less to them now than it did a few weeks ago. And I also think that they probably also calculate that if there is some kind of a forced removal of Zelensky from power in Ukraine, in Kiev now, Whereas back in February or March, that might have strengthened the power structure there by putting a more effective person in charge. Today, it would probably weaken it. In the context of everything else that's going wrong, more people in Ukraine would probably say to themselves, well, things are falling apart. Even our constitution and political system isn't working anymore. So I think the calculation may be changing in Moscow, but I also get the sense that as far as Washington and Ukraine itself is concerned, Zelensky may be on borrowed time. There is a parallel. There's a very important parallel to this. Let's be clear. This is, as you correctly said, may not happen, but there was something fairly similar happened in Saigon in 1963 in South Vietnam. There was the leader of South Vietnam, who was a man called President Diem, who was in some ways, a much more intelligent man than Zelensky, but also very eccentric and very strange, and presided over a very corrupt regime, and he'd put a lot of members of his family in very prominent positions, and he was clearly losing the war against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And the army in South Vietnam were becoming utterly exasperated with this man who was, as I say, very eccentric and very autocratic. They contacted the US, or at least that's the story we've been told. There was lots of discussion in Washington about whether or not to back a coup against Diem. Eventually, they did back the coup against Diem, and the coup happened. Diem was overthrown. This is just 6 weeks before Kennedy himself, by the way, was assassinated. Diem was overthrown. The military took over. And there were wide expectations that that would stabilize the situation in South Vietnam, that you'd have more conventional and intelligent people in charge. And what it actually did, in fact, is that it destroyed the entire legitimacy of the power structure and probably, in the end, weakened South Vietnam even more than, Diem, with all his eccentricities, had been weakening it whilst in office. So, there is that parallel. And if we do see a coup against Zelensky, and if it is successful, it's one perhaps to hold on to and to think about.
All right, one final observation. I'd like your thoughts. Do you think there's any connection between this palace intrigue and Boris Johnson and the fact that Boris Johnson is leaving? Do you think that perhaps, just perhaps, Boris Johnson was kind of the go-between? He was the handler of Zelensky in a way, for lack of a better word. The handler. He was the guy that told the intelligence services, the DC swamp, the think tanks, the CIAs and the MI6s, all these groups, the globalists in the EU and Brussels. Maybe Boris Johnson was the guy that said, look, I'll deal with Zelensky. I'll keep an eye on him. I'll go to Kiev. I'll make sure he's doing what we want. Don't worry about it. I understand him. We get along. And I'll make sure he's, on the straight and narrow, so to speak. Do you think that perhaps Boris Johnson's exit has now kind of opened up a little bit of a vacuum? And there are now these various other forces that you mentioned earlier in the video that are saying, okay, look, we don't have anyone to really deal with this clown, so let's be done with him. It's just a thought. I'm not saying this is what's going on, but right. I just find the timing of this kind of interesting. And definitely Boris Johnson did appear to have some sort of special connection with with Zelensky. That's for sure.
Right. Well, the short answer is I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it. But having you mentioning it, I think you might have hit the bullseye, in the sense that Boris Johnson was, without any question at all, Zelensky's great personal supporter amongst the top Western leaders. I mean, he developed this peculiar bond, you could say two clowns coming together. But anyway, there was this extraordinary personal bond between Johnson and Zelensky. I mean, whenever Johnson was in trouble, who did he get on the phone to? He got on the phone to Zelensky. So, I mean, so there's this extraordinary, intense personal relationship, this bonding between the two. Johnson is on his way out. With Johnson going, Zelensky has lost his prime advocate, backer, and supporter in the West. And, without Johnson, it could very well be that all the people who are saying to themselves, we've got rid of one clown, let's get rid of the other, let's have some more rational people in charge at last. It could very well be that now they feel that they've got the space, the political space to do it. Because whatever one may say about Johnson, he still is, by the way, but he has been Britain's Prime Minister. So, he's been the person who's, been able to talk up for Zelensky and, the top councils, NATO, the G7, all of that. And with him firmly out of the way, firmly on the way out, we don't have to worry about Johnson anymore. Probably there's people in Britain, in the intelligence services and in the Ministry of Defence who are as exasperated by Zelensky as everybody else is. So, with Johnson going, quite possibly, people are now saying, well, now we might as well see the back of this man. Johnson isn't there to speak up for him anymore or to control him as he once did. So let's finally end this farce and put in someone like perhaps Zelensky or conceivably the former president Poroshenko and put them in, and they're more conventional people. We can work better with them, and perhaps that can make us sort out all these problems with the war and find a way of achieving whatever political objective we're still trying to achieve there. I mean, as I said, I think that would be a huge mistake. I don't think it would work out like that at all. I can easily see how this could backfire, but I can also see why people might be making those kind of calculations. And certainly without Johnson to speak up for Zelensky, it becomes easier to see why a coup against him might happen.
Yeah, coincidentally, Poroshenko, I believe, is in London. That's interesting. Yeah. And wasn't it you that said, I think you mentioned that the last person that Boris called when he was leaving office or something along those lines was actually Zelensky? I mean, what was the story there?
I mean, it's absolutely correct. I mean, just before he decided to resign, after he decided to resign, but just before he made his resignation announcement, he actually telephoned Zelensky.
What does that tell you?
He took. I mean, it's an extraordinary way. It tells you. I mean, let's put it kindly, the extent of the friendship between these two people. But it also tells you the extent to which Johnson had become psychologically dependent on Zelensky, of all people. It was a bizarre thing to say, but I mean, he really did. He was going to Zelensky for sympathy, of all things, which no doubt he got. But that tells you also how, what an important ally for Zelensky Johnson was, because, as I said, Johnson was the Prime Minister of Britain. And, of course, now that Johnson is definitely on his way out, I mean, he's essentially lost power now, he doesn't have his protector in the West anymore.
Exactly. I mean, can't you see the phone call, just to wrap it up, the phone call going along the lines of, look, Volodymyr stepping down, but don't worry, we'll find someone else to take care of you.
Oh,
or, or maybe something along the lines of, I'm stepping down, so watch your back, because, you're not going to have me around anymore. I mean, I could really picture something like that taking place.
Absolutely, of course I can, in both cases. And I would say, by the way, whatever happened over the course of that telephone call, and both of the alternatives that you've outlined are completely plausible. A recording of it will certainly exist, and transcripts will have already been made and distributed to all the right, or perhaps I should say wrong people. So don't be under any illusions about this.
The timing of all these things just is interesting. All right. Any final thoughts about the purge before we wrap this up?
This is a further sign that, the fact that there's been this huge purge is a further sign that things in Ukraine are starting to fall apart. I mean, a confident, successful, victorious government doesn't do these things. People are congratulating each other, not trying to sack each other. And the fact, as I said, there's no doubt at all that he did try to sack these people. He even announced the name of the person who was going to take over the SBU. So there's no doubt at all that he was intending to sack these people. But clearly, he lacks the institutional authority to make it happen, which shows that his authority is crumbling.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you. All right, the Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Telegram as well. And the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code GOODDAY. Take care.